Where exactly does mobility fit if we were to compare it against stretching, especially on some of the lifts, like getting into the proper depth when you're doing a squat, or
Right.
knowing when it's like knowing how to properly engage your hips so that you can actually execute the deadlift, and
Yep.
when you're doing things like the bench press, where do those different factors play?
So the big thing, if we look at like stretching, so what does stretching do? Because this will tie into like exactly what you're talking about. So stretching is gonna lengthen the tissues. It's gonna lengthen your muscles, your tendons. It's also gonna lengthen your ligaments. Even though your ligaments are a static structure, they should have a defined length. But if someone has an injury and the joint has been immobilized for a while, the ligaments are going to tighten up. So stretching will help them to gain their length and their flexibility back, because you got to have a certain length in your ligaments to allow the what they call accessory movements of a joint, enough slack in the system to perform a full range of motion. So that's what stretching is going to do. It's going to lengthen the muscles, the ligaments, the tendons, and it's also going to lengthen your nerves and your nerves' ability to slide through um, the muscles and through the adjacent structures. So what does stretching do? It does those things by quieting your nervous system. It turns your nervous system off slightly, and it quiets your stretch reflex and your deep tendon reflex. So like when you go to the doctor and the doctor hits your knee with a hammer and your leg jumps. That's
Mhm.
an example of a deep tendon reflex or a stretch reflex. What he's doing is introducing a quick stretch on the tendon, which stretches the muscle, and your nervous system reflexively contracts, and that's a healthy response. So when we're stretching, that resistance that you feel initially is your body fighting that stretch. So when you hold a static stretch, you're teaching your body to relax and quiet that reflex down. So like we talked about before, how mobility is preparing you for activity and preparing you to lift and get your hips ready for a deadlift, hips ready for a squat, your trunk ready for a squat, your chest, shoulders, and back for a bench or any pushing or pulling. Um, you don't want those muscles to learn or be trained right before you do that to go to full length and quiet, because that's when you're going to get injured. So
Right.
if you're trying to squat and you're putting a tremendous amount of stretch throughout your glutes on the bottom, and you just stretch your glutes out for 15 minutes before you squatted, when they get down there, your nervous system is going to relax a little bit. Even though you're under a load, it's going to relax a little bit, and it's not going to be there to lift you up. So if your glutes aren't firing, then your hamstrings are going to fire to try to compensate for that. And so that glute hip or glute hamstring timing pattern is thrown off. And in that example, what happens is when your glutes don't fire first or effectively enough, when you're trying to perform hip extension, whether it's running, squatting, deadlifting, and your high hamstrings fire first, because of the way your hamstring asserts on your pelvis, it's actually going to push the femoral head, the ball forward in the socket, which is going to destabilize you, and it's going to tighten up your hip flexors. You're going to pitch forward, and it's
Mhm.
going to probably your back is going to get overworked, and you might strain a hamstring. All right, so that's why mobility prepares those structures in your body to get under the bar, to go for a run. So in that scenario where you've got someone who's got a lot of slack and they're down there and they're used to stretching a lot, they're really exposing themselves because they've quieted this muscle down, or they taught their muscle right before activity to, when I lengthen you, relax and let it stretch.
Mm.
But what the activity you're about to engage in doesn't require that. It requires the opposite. It requires you to lengthen with a good amount of tension, get to a point of stability, and then contract back. So that's where a lot of injuries occur. Um, is like if someone rolls an ankle or a non-contact ACL type injury, um, the joint started to move too far, and that stretch reflex wasn't there. That little like the the same input that the doctor's hitting you with a little hammer is not there when your muscle stretches on an athletic field to come back, and it allows the joint to go a little bit too far, tears an ACL, tears a deltoid ligament of the ankle, strains the ligament. So that's where like the mobility is what you want to engage in prior to an exercise or an activity. It's retraining your body to do what it needs to do, for what you're going to ask it to do when you compete or when you exercise. Now, stretching is still important though. So it's not, sounds like I'm bad mouthing stretching. So stretching, and I hope I'm not going away from your question far.
You're good.
Right. Stretching is more of a recovery tool. And it, like we said, it is important. You need to be flexible in order to have good mobility, right? But being flexible doesn't mean you have good mobility. It's kind of like that message. But stretching is important, and it's more of, like I said, a recovery tool, because after you work out, you exercise, or you had a long day at work, we're holding our bodies up against gravity. So there are muscles that are working constantly. So without us being truly aware of it, we're going to be overworking one group of muscles more than another, most likely. And so when you stretch, it's a good idea to stretch after you exercise, or after a long day, or after a competition, because when the muscle gets fatigued, it's going to want to tighten up to recover. So if it doesn't get that chance to recover and it doesn't regain its length, that's an area that's going to be probably your future injury.